Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia is one of two Smithsonian Airspace museums in Washington, D.C. area, and it happens to be the bigger and the better one. The museum has dozens of amazing aircraft in the exposition, many of which are unique because they are found in only one surviving unit. Without further ado, let's look at those aircraft through the eyes of a Russian. The first in our review of the museum is Corsair F4U. The fighter plane saw service primarily in World War II and the Korean War, primarily as a carrier-based aircraft. Early problems with carrier landings and logistics led to it being eclipsed by the Grumman F6F Hellcat. However, soon enough, situation changed. Issues were resolved and 12,500 Corsairs were manufactured between 1942 and 1953. It was one of the most successful piston-engine fighter planes. In the final years of the war, the kill-to-loss ratio in battles against Japanese A6M0 was 12-1. This means for every lost in air fight Corsair, 12 Japanese Zeros were shot down. It's worth noting, however, that by the time the Americans began actively deploying the Corsairs, the Japanese had already lost nearly all of their experienced pilots and aces. This drove the success ratio up very significantly. P-40 Warhawk, American single-engined all-metal fighter bomber that first flew in 1938. This was the further development of an earlier P-36 Hawk. Total of 13,700 of these machines were built. In England and Soviet Union, this machine was known as Tomahawk and Kitty Hawk. This aircraft was not impressive in any aspect, but was simple and easy to operate, which is very important during the time of war. 2,243 of such aircraft were supplied to Soviet Union by Lend-Lease. Despite the rather impressive number of Lend-Lease Tomahawks, they did not particularly distinguish themselves on the Eastern Front. The fault lay not so much with the aircraft's characteristics as with the lack of repair base. For some reason, the Americans failed to supply enough spare parts as well as documentation, making field repairs of the P-40 extremely difficult. Special Evaluation and Feedback Committee of the Soviet Union Armed Forces reported in 1943, I quote,
"The Kitty Hawk fighter, in terms of flight and tactical characteristics, is inferior to the Air Cobra and German Messerschmitt Me-109. It can successfully fight the Messerschmitt in horizontal maneuvers, but is at a disadvantage in vertical ones. It can effectively perform a role of an interceptor against bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Among pilots, the opinion has formed that P-40 can be a good aircraft for such missions as escorting bombers and conducting reconnaissance."
End of quote. F-105 Thunderchief is a fighter bomber that served with the United States Air Force from 1958 to 1984. Capable of Mach 2, it is the only American aircraft to have been removed from combat due to high loss rates. F-105D's early career was plagued with maintenance problems and in-flight failures. The origins of the nickname Thud were obscure. Some claim that it stood for the sound of an F-105 crashing into the ground. When the Thunderchief entered service, it was the largest single-seat, single-engine combat aircraft in history. The Thunderchief was later replaced by both the F-4 Phantom II and the swing-wing beauty F-111 Aardvark. CH-46E Sea Knight. It was built between 1962 and 1971. This was the daddy of the later introduced CH-47 Chinook, which took part in near all American initiated military conflicts. Think of Vietnam War images, for instance, or the war in Iraq. And this weird looking little aircraft is N1M, a great granddaddy of modern days B-2 stealth bomber. N1M was first flown in 1940. It was a test bed for the flying wing concept. This one-seater was made exclusively in order to try and refine the mere idea of a plane with no tail and elevator. This concept later evolved into Granddaddy YB-35 and then the Daddy YB-49, and then only B-2 stealth bomber was born. Nakajima J1N1S, a night fighter variant of a reconnaissance aircraft. Japan built a total of 470 of them between 1942 and 1944. Skillful Japanese pilots had spectacular success against American B-29. Lieutenant Sacha Endo was credited with destroying 8 B-29s and damaging another 8. By the end of World War II, these airplanes were used in kamikaze anti-shipping missions. Only one J1N1 Gekko survives today, and this is it. And now my most favorite one, Dornier Do 335, a heavy push-pull configuration fighter built by Dornier in Germany during World War II. The founder of this German manufacturer was Franco-German Claudius Dornier, hence such unusual for Germany name. This aircraft was one of the fastest piston-engined aircraft ever. It could reach speeds of about 800 km per hour at flight level and could outrun most of the military aircraft at the time. Only 37 of these were built, mostly prototypes, because delivery started in 1945 and the war in Europe ended soon after. There are no publicly known combat missions performed by this aircraft. Only one surviving unit remains to this day, and it is right here in this museum, which makes this unit very unique indeed. Just look at this beauty, made for speed. This is such an eye candy. Arado Ar 234 Blitz. It is a bomber designed and produced by the German aircraft manufacturer Arado. It was the world's first operational turbojet-powered bomber, seen service during the final months of the Second World War. Only 214 units were ever built due to the lack of available jet engines. The AR-234 continued to fly combat missions until the surrender of Germany on 8th of May 1945. Only one of them survived to this day, and it is right here too. Kawanishi N1K2. N1K2 fighter plane was considered by both its pilots and opponents to be one of the finest land-based fighters flown by the Japanese during World War II. It was introduced in 1943. Total number of built units 1,532. Was used very effectively over Formosa, which is known today as Taiwan, the Philippines and Okinawa. It had roll rate of 82 degrees per second at 386 kilometers per hour and had 4 powerful 20mm cannons in the wings. One of the encounters with this plane took place when Japanese pilots initially mistook F-4U Corsairs for Hellcats and attacked. A 30-minute duel ensued in which 3 Corsairs were shot down and another 5 damaged. 3 other F-4Us returned to the carrier and were so heavily damaged that the planes were scrapped. No N1K2 were lost to Corsairs in that battle. Heinkel 219 Udo. It is a night fighter designed and produced by the German aircraft manufacturer Heinkel. 268 were built between 1941 and 1944. This model has SN2 radar system, complete with high-drag 4 two-dipole element aerials. The Heinkel 219 was a capable fighter aircraft, and the pilots claimed many victories in the night sky over Allied bombers. Heinkel 219 was the only piston-engined night fighter capable of combat with the Mosquito on equal terms, given its speed, maneuverability, and firepower. However, it was never able to play a significant role in the conflict because Germany's industrial base failing to produce it in sufficient numbers. FA-330, a German motorless rotor kite which was towed behind their submarines to see around better. Note that it has no motor of any sort. P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a successful high-altitude fighter, and it also served as the foremost American fighter bomber in the ground attack role. P-47 was one of the main United States Air Force's fighters in World War II. It also served in France, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. 190 of P-47 were delivered to Soviet Union in 1944 and 5 more in 1945. Thunderbolt disappointed Soviet test pilots and engineers. One of the best test pilots, Mark Galay, recalled of testing P-47.
Just after the first few minutes of flying, I realized this is not a fighter plane. Stable, with comfortable, spacious cockpit, roomy, pleasant to fly, but not the fighter. Thunderbolt had unsatisfactory maneuverability in horizontal and especially in vertical flight patterns. It was gaining speed too slowly because of the inertia of a heavy machine.
Shut up!
Where was I? Yes, right. Thunderbolt would fit perfectly for simple flight level flying without any abrupt maneuvers. It is not acceptable for fighter planes which have to be agile.
Focke-Wulf 190. Number built over 20,000 units between August 1941 and 1945. Along with Bf-109, 190 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe and soon became one of the best fighter planes of the World War II. Beyond turn radius, the 190 outperformed British main fighter plane Spitfire in most areas such as roll rate, speed acceleration, and dive performance. When British learned of this new German Wunderwaffe, they started a frantic hunt for this nimble machine and even planned an operation to hijack one of those from German bases with the desperate purpose of studying it. But then, all of a sudden, they had gotten an unexpected gift. A German pilot landed one of those newest machines in Wales by mistake in air navigation. Focke-Wulf 190 was used very extensively in the Eastern Front against Soviet Union too, but it didn't show any remarkable advantages over the latest Soviet aircraft at the time. By early 1944, Russian fighter planes had better maneuverability. However, higher diving speed allowed German 190 relatively easily escape an attack and flee. Additionally, very powerful armament allowed Focke-Wulf destroy their adversary from the first successful hit. By early 1944, however, Germany and their many allies ran out of experienced pilots, while Soviet Air Force, in contrast, gained a lot of skill and modernized their pool of fighters. Russian pilots were well trained and highly motivated to pay the Germans back for their war crimes. This quickly changed the tide and made German pilots easy prey to the Russians. Boeing B-29 Superfortress is a strategic bomber which was flown primarily by the United States during World War II and the Korean War. One of the largest aircraft of the World War II. B-29 was designed with state-of-the-art technology, which included a pressurized cabin, dual-wheeled tricycle landing gear, and an analog computer-controlled fire system that allowed one gunner and a fire control officer to direct 4 remote machine gun turrets. No other machine of the time had anything like it. B-29 program was the most expensive of the war. It cost $3 billion to design and produce, which would be equivalent to $55 billion in mid-2025. Total of 3,970 units were built. On top of that count, the Soviet Union produced 847 Tupolev Tu-4 Bulls, an unlicensed reverse-engineered copy of the B-29. To be fair and honest, however, it has to be said that Soviet government made many attempts to purchase a license and to hire American engineers to produce this machine during the World War II, but they had always received either runaround or clear no. Incidentally, in June 1944, a B-29 under the command of Captain Howard Gerald, named Ramp Tramp, was shot down by the Japanese over occupied China. The captain decided to land at the nearest Allied airfield, which, due to proximity, happened to be in the Soviet Union. Then, on August 20, 1944, another B-29 was shot down but managed to reach Russian territory. The crew had escaped by parachute, and the aircraft crashed on Soviet land. In November 1944, the captain of a third B-29 lost his aerial position and safely landed at the same Soviet airfield. In each of these incidents, the crew members were received as friends, treated as heroes, and taken to the American embassy in Moscow in great comfort. Shortly after, all of them returned home with honor. However, their aircraft were taken apart and meticulously studied by Soviet engineers. The Soviet copy of B-29 was superior in many aspects. For instance, Russians used better and more modern radio navigation equipment. Russian engines had 2,400 horsepower each versus 2,200 in America. That is the whopping 800 horsepower more. Russian armament of the aircraft consisted of 10 high firing rate 23mm cannons versus original 12 machine guns of 12.7mm. The difference in Russian replica firepower was double. Overall, Tu-4 Bull came out to be significantly more potent and dangerous war machine than American B-29. 22 B-29s have survived to this day. The one that is on display here was specifically the aircraft which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6 of 1945. Another B-29 dropped one more atomic bomb on Nagasaki, a different Japanese city, 3 days later on August 9. Over 100,000 people died instantly in these two bombings, and 140,000 more died slowly of radiation poisoning over the next few months. The bombing was unnecessary because imperialistic Japan was only one step away from capitulation in August of 1945. They knew that the Soviets, after taking Berlin, were moving their unstoppable armed forces from Europe down to the Far East and were about to declare war on Japan. They realized that they stand no chance against Russians. Their fear was, however, that if Soviet troops land on their territory after defeating Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria very quickly, which indeed did happen, they would have made locals convert to communist ideology, very popular in the whole world at the time, by the way. Even in America, it was gaining popularity by day after World War II, which is precisely why McCarthyism as a movement was ordered, cooked up, and executed in the USA in 1950s. So having Japan convert to being Soviet meant the end of the old elite's rule, and the only option to stop it was to capitulate now, before the Russian land operation ever had a chance to start. Americans knew it too. Therefore, Americans, in attempt to prevent Russian invasion of Japan at any cost, dropped the atomic bombs in a desperate attempt to force Japanese to surrender immediately, before it is too late. And knowing how Japanese invaders treated innocent Chinese while on their land, the fate of hundreds of thousands Japanese civilians was decided. An old American saying says, "Be sure your sins will seek you out." Yes, this world is not vegetarian whether you like it or not. And this, along with other side reasons, is what happened to Japan. This particular aircraft on display was nothing but a tool to achieve the goal, which indeed was achieved. The aspect of justification of atomic bombing of civilians in Japan is complex and multifaceted. If there is enough interest showing, I can make a separate film just for that one topic alone. Please feel free to leave your comments. P-38 Lightning. It is an American single-seat fighter aircraft that was used during World War II. It has distinctive twin-boom design. 10,037 machines of this type were built. In early models during high-speed flight approaching Mach 0.68, the aircraft's tail would begin to shake violently, and the nose would tuck under. Once caught in this dive, the fighter would leave the pilot no option but to bail out. In 1943, dive flaps were installed and proved to be effective in fighting the issue. Boeing 707. It is an early American long-range airliner, the first jetliner to enter service. This was the plane that made air travel affordable to most Americans for the first time when it started carrying passengers in October of 1958 with Pan Am. Hawker Hurricane. It is a British single-seat aircraft of the 30s and 40s. It was developed through several versions. Total of 484 of such aircraft were supplied to the USSR during the World War II. Soviet Engineering Committee reported that some of the supplied planes were old, used, and had missing parts and components. Hurricane looked unusually big for Russian fighter pilots. The very first practical application of this aircraft showed a whole list of shortcomings. One of the worst was weak armament, which couldn't harm German planes. There were cases when Ju-88 were hit by a hurricane continually, but still couldn't destroy them. Armament reliability was very low too, jamming and locking up constantly. Landing gear was poorly designed. The pilot's armor protection was weak. The flight characteristics did not compare well to either German or Russian aircraft of the time too. Boeing Model 307 Stratoliner, or Stratoclipper in Pan American service, is an American 4-engine tailwheel monoplane airliner derived from the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, which entered commercial service in July 1940. It was the first airliner in revenue service with fully pressurized cabin, which, with supercharged engines, allowed it to cruise above the weather at 20,000 feet. This gave Boeing a major advantage over competition in every aspect. It had a capacity for 33 passengers, which later increased to 38 and then eventually up to 60. The first customer delivery was to millionaire Howard Hughes on July 13, 1939. He bought aircraft's serial number 1997 for $315,000 for a round-the-world flight, hoping to break his own record of 91 hours and 14 minutes that he set in 1939 in a Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra. Hughes's Stratoliner was fitted with extra fuel tanks and was ready for the first leg of the round-the-world attempt when Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. The flight attempt was cancelled. Junkers Ju-52-3M. It is a transport aircraft that was designed and manufactured by German company Junkers. First introduced during 1930s as a civilian airliner, it was adapted into a military transport. The most popular version had 3 engines, which is why the 3M designation in the name. Grumman F8F Bearcat didn't catch the war action. This plane had one of the most powerful piston engines of its time, a 18-cylinder air-cooled double-star Pratt & Whitney R2800. The aircraft was noted for its excellent handling qualities, respectable maneuverability and good rate of climb. However, it had poor directional stability. It had tendency to suddenly shake violently at higher speeds. During a test flight, it flipped over its wing and crashed into the ground. The cause was later determined to be an overload exceeding the aircraft's structural limits. By 1948, Navy pilots had identified a major shortcoming: the aircraft's weak gun armament. It turned out to be a capable peacetime fighter. Yet combat service could not be avoided. Marine Corps Bearcats flew from air bases in Korea during 1950, but their only defenses, agility and the speed of attack, often proved insufficient. After retirement from service, a number of disarmed Bearcats were sold to private owners. Racing variants underwent radical modifications. One such aircraft with a 3,800 horsepower engine was flown to a speed of 850 kilometers per hour at low altitude. His record still stands today as the absolute speed record for piston engine aircraft. P-61 Black Widow. It was the first operational US warplane designed specifically as a night fighter. It was introduced in late 1944 and had seen success in fighting adversary night fighters. Only 4 P-61s are known to survive today, and this is one of the 4. Grumman Goose G-21. Goose is an amphibious flying boat to serve as an 8-seat commuter aircraft. This aircraft appears in many motion and animation movies, including DuckTales and my personally favorite comedy film, Planes by Disney Studios. Remember that quirky double-prop girl plane that adored Dusty? That's her. Fun fact, they used a real registration number on her board. It does exist. However, it belongs to a Beechcraft Bonanza, a totally different airplane just like this. Another fun fact, in the movie, Dusty's girlfriend had tricycle landing gear with front wheel, while in reality, G-21 is tail-wheeled aircraft with a small wheel in the back. Estimates suggest that out of 345 Grumman G-21 produced, about 30 Gooses remain airworthy today. Lockheed C-121 Constellation. This is a military transport version of the Lockheed Constellation. A total of 332 aircraft were constructed. Although originally intended for cargo transport duties, they were usually fitted out with 44-seat passenger transport interiors. This plane was called the best 3-engine aircraft because one of its 4 engines would fail in flight more often than not. Dwight Eisenhower and General Douglas MacArthur both used the C-121A as their personal VIP transport. The Concorde is an Anglo-French airliner that was retired on October of 2003. This was the world's second supersonic airliner put in commercial use after Soviets' Tu-144. Even though Russians were the first, the Concorde, however, had better success because Soviets' airliner experienced a series of issues with engines in early models, and then had catastrophic incident in Paris at Le Bourget on June 3, 1973. Tu-144 did not get cancelled immediately after, and rather was successfully improved and developed further into a reliable and safe machine. But with change of government leadership after death of General Secretary Brezhnev, it had lost its appeal due to high cost and low return on investment. Tu-144 continued flying until 1999, but was no longer in commercial use by airliners. Concorde, however, did not get subjected to the same financial constraints. And the reason is because Russians had priority in serving meager commoners like regular Joe Schmo and Jane Doe. The ticket's price for Tu-144 in Soviets was only marginally higher than those for any other aircraft of the time. It was people's country. In contrast to Soviets, the Concorde was aimed rather at rich have-it-alls, who were willing to cough up some serious dough for every flight between Europe and America just to boast about it to their rich friends at their nearest golf game. When your targeted audience is so drastically different, you aren't constrained with cost of flight concern because no matter what, your clients will cover the expense. And that, and nothing else, is what made Concorde survive and continue flying for many more years. I happen to have seen both of these amazing aircraft in action. I had seen Concorde in JFK docked at my boarding area when I was traveling abroad in 2002, and I had seen Soviet Tu-144 at the International Airport of Alma-Ata, where I was born longer time ago than I care to remember. Together, these two machines are a true marvel. AT-400 Air Tractor. Remember Dusty from Disney's movie Planes? His resting place is right here in this museum. Dusty does exist in real life. This aircraft was originally designed for agricultural use, but thanks to its versatile design, it was adapted to many other roles and went through many reincarnations like previous model AT-300 and successors AT-501, 602, 802, and even truly military one like OA-1K Sky Raider 2. Therefore, his affiliation with Air Force was not made up in the movie that much in the end. There is a contract for 75 of these Dusty modification that is worth $3 billion to build. But in our hearts, Air Tractor will always be Dusty. Sukhoi Su-26M is an aerobatic aircraft from the Soviet Union. It made its first flight in June of 1984. In 1986, both the men's and the women's team prizes were won in this aircraft at the World Aerobatics Championships. This aircraft dominated 2003 and 2005 Aerobatics World Championships as well, and the 2004 European Championships too. It would not be exaggeration to say that Su-26 is one of the finest aerobatic airplanes of the world ever built. Helicopters. Sikorsky HH-52 Sea Guard, American S-55, the design of which was initiated privately by Russian immigrant Igor Sikorsky, without government sponsorship. This helicopter looks so very similar to Soviet's Mi-4, designed and built during the same era. However, Russian Mi-4 is nearly 50% larger and heavier than S-55. This is the helicopter which my dad was flying as a pilot in 60s and 70s. There is Robinson R-44, the king of private rotorcopting. More than 6,800 of these were built. There is an old-timer Bell helicopter parked right next to Robinson. Hiller ROE rotor cycle. Hiller XH-44, another experimental rotorcraft. Only one of these were ever built. Bell 30, a prototype for the first commercial helicopter. 3 of these were built, and this is the first of those. And this is an early prototype for a gyroplane, an aircraft that looks like a helicopter but has passive main rotor without any engine. Space Shuttle OV-103. Yes, this museum has the authentic Space Shuttle Discovery, the one that actually was in space and made 5,830 orbits around Earth. This amazing machine had 39 flights total between 1984 and 2011. Cumulatively, it spent 365 days, a whole year, in orbit over the span of 27 years. Discovery flew more flights than any other orbiter shuttle. On April 25, 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope was placed into orbit by the crew members of the Space Shuttle Discovery. The large reflecting telescope was the most sophisticated optical observatory ever to orbit Earth, and the photographs it collected ultimately revolutionized the field of astronomy. Here on display also are a command module as well as the Mercury Capsule 15B Freedom 7. And we are back from outer space down to the Earth. MiG-21 Fishbat, Soviet supersonic jet fighter and interceptor aircraft. This is the most produced supersonic jet aircraft in aviation history. Total of 11,469 units were produced. Approximately 60 countries across 4 continents have flown the MiG-21, and it still serves many nations 7 decades after its maiden flight. MiG-15 is a jet fighter aircraft introduced in 1949. Over 17,000 of these were built. MiG-15 was very successful in Korean War, rivaling American F-86 Sabre, parked right next. F-86 was the only close aircraft that could match the MiG-15. Total of 659 MiG-15s were lost in combat in Korean War, while 1,106 aircraft were shot down by MiG-15s. Data matching with Soviet records suggests that US pilots routinely attributed their own combat losses to landing accidents or other losses. F-4S Phantom II. It is an American two-seat, twin-engine supersonic jet interceptor and fighter bomber. The Phantom is a large fighter with a top speed of over Mach 2.2. It can carry more than 8 tons of weapons on 9 external hardpoints. The F-4 was used extensively during the Vietnam War as a ground attack and reconnaissance aircraft. The United States Air Force and the US Navy had high expectations of the F-4 Phantom, assuming that the massive firepower, the best available onboard radar, the highest speed and acceleration properties, coupled with new tactics, would provide Phantoms with an advantage over the MiGs. However, in confrontations with much lighter MiG-21, F-4s did not always succeed and began to suffer heavy losses. Over the course of the air war in Vietnam, between 1965 and 1973, each side would claim favorable kills ratios. Phantom was retired in US in 1996 and was replaced with more modern F-15s, F-16s and F-14s. T-33 Shooting Star. It is an American subsonic jet trainer. And no, it is not a fighter plane. It was made to train fighter plane pilots. T-33 made its first flight in 1948. A reconnaissance version known as the RT-33A was also produced. Interestingly enough, it served with over 30 nations and continues to operate as a trainer in other countries. A number of these beautiful aircraft are owned privately and often participate in aviation shows like this one, which I caught at Sun and Fun in Lakeland, Florida. A6 Intruder. It is a twin-jet, all-weather subsonic attack aircraft designed to replace the piston-engined Douglas A-1 Sky Raider. A6 first saw action during the Vietnam War. Its typical mission of flying low to deliver payload made it especially vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Total of 84 A6 aircraft of various series were lost. 693 units of this type were built, and it was retired in 1997. F-8 Crusader is a single-engine supersonic carrier-based jet aircraft. It was the last American fighter that had guns as the primary weapon. F-8 played a crucial role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, providing essential low-level photographs of Soviet missiles in Cuba during the Caribbean crisis that were made impossible to acquire by other means at the time. The Crusader was not an easy aircraft to fly. It was unforgiving in carrier landings and suffered poor recovery from high sink rates. It had poorly designed nose undercarriage, which made it hard to steer on the deck. Safe landings required the carriers to steam at full speed to offset the relatively high landing speed of the Crusader. Not surprisingly, the Crusader mishap rate was relatively high compared to its contemporaries. Nevertheless, it was used for 2 decades in fighter variants and even longer in reconnaissance version. X-35 Joint Strike. It is a concept demonstrator for a universal aircraft for NATO military. It went into production as F-35. There are several different versions. F-35A is for a conventional takeoff and landing and aimed at replacing F-16 and A-10. F-35B is a short takeoff and vertical landing version to replace F-18 and Harrier. And finally, F-35C is a carrier version to replace Super Hornets. You might also be amused to learn that while starting development on X-35, Lockheed acquired technical data from cancelled Soviet supersonic aircraft program Yak-141, which was intended to be the Russian vertical takeoff and landing fighter jet, replacing infamous Yak-38 Forger. The first flight of Yak-141 took place on March 9, 1987, and it performed first hovering on December 29, 1989. When Soviet Union was skillfully destroyed in 1991, Lockheed entered into joint venture with Russians, promising joint construction of 3 more prototypes and an additional static test aircraft together, but instead silently withdrew shortly after, taking all technical documentation with them. Lockheed studies Russian swivel nose design, which resulted in the X-35B and Yak-141 design similarities. However, there is still a difference. The X-35B uses a shaft-driven lift fan for vertical lift augmentation, while the Yak-141 uses 2 dedicated lift engines. Yak-141 never made it into production. F-14 Tomcat is an American supersonic, twin-engine variable sweep-wing fighter aircraft. It is a large and well-equipped fighter which was designed to combat against smaller, more maneuverable MiG fighters. Tomcat can reach speed of Mach 2.3 at altitude and Mach 1.2 at sea level, and it can climb up to 53,000 feet. This aircraft was central to the 1986 film Top Gun with Tom Cruise, and it appeared in many more feature films. It is a very good-looking aircraft. As to the technical concerns, it had weak and very unreliable engine, which was the cause for heavy non-combat losses. Additionally, the engine was prone to compressor stall at high angles of attack and during abrupt throttle movement at supersonic speeds. That, coupled with high cost for production and operation, was the reason to cancel the program in 1991. The Tomcat was retired by the US Navy in September of 2006. FA-18 Hornet. It is a supersonic multi-role combat aircraft, designed as both a fighter and a ground attack aircraft. The Hornet entered operational service in 1983 and first saw combat action during 1986 United States bombing of Libya and subsequently participated in the 1991 Gulf War and 2003 Iraq War. 1,480 of such aircraft were built between 1974 and 2000. It is highly maneuverable due to its good thrust-to-weight ratio. Hornet has digital fly-by-wire control system. The leading edge extensions allow it to remain controllable at high angles of attack. There are plans to use the FA-18 until the early 1930s. F-100 Super Sabre is an American supersonic jet fighter aircraft, the further development of highly successful F-86 Sabre. It was the first United States Air Force fighter capable of supersonic speed in level flight. This makes Super Sabre a match to Soviet MiG-19, which was the first Russian jet fighter in such class. F-100 was used extensively in the war in Vietnam. It had made the highest number of sorties among all aircraft used in the conflict. This aircraft dropped thousands of tons of napalm over Vietnamese jungle. Total of 242 Super Sabre were lost in Vietnam, however, there were no losses in aerial combat. Most of the losses were caused by ground anti-aircraft fire. The most tragic incident in history involving the F-100 occurred in 1962 in Turkey, when the pilot of a Turkish F-100C fighter lost control and his Super Sabre crashed into a passenger train. 250 people were killed. Sikorsky S-43, also known as Baby Clipper, is an American twin-engine amphibious flying boat monoplane produced by Sikorsky Aircraft. It first flew in 1935 and was a smaller version of the Sikorsky S-42 Clipper, none of which survived to current days out of 10 built units total. Baby Clipper S-43 accommodated between 18 and 25 passengers. Total of 53 were built. On April 14, 1936, an S-43 with a 500 kilograms payload, piloted by another Russian immigrant, Boris Sergeyevsky, set an altitude world record for amphibious aircraft, when it reached an altitude of 27,950 feet over Stamford, Connecticut. His good friend and the designer of the aircraft, famous Igor Sikorsky, was aboard with him. Sikorsky, by the way, was a distinguished aircraft designer long time before immigrating to the United States in March of 1919 at the age of 30. Until then, he was producing various airplanes of his personal design for the Russian Empire and became close friends with Russian Emperor Nicholas II. Here on this photo, Igor Ivanovich is with him. Sikorsky designed and produced the largest airplane in the world at the time, Ilya Muromets, which he built 90 units of. No one even attempted to build anything remotely close in size before Sikorsky. He personally set several world's speed records of its time with 2 and 3 passengers on board. In 1915, Sikorsky built world's first mass-produced fighter plane, S-16. At the same time, Sikorsky was designing and building world's first helicopter prototypes since 1905. Impressive, right? But what if I tell you that none of it mattered to Americans? Indeed, after immigrating to the United States, fleeing the Great Russian October Revolution of 1917, he had very hard time convincing American society that he can be of help as an aircraft engineer. No one simply wanted to hire him. He had to work as a mathematics teacher for 4 years, saving every penny he could spare before he founded his own company, Sikorsky Aero Engineering Corporation. And he struggled several first years to stay afloat and succeeded only because of his personal perseverance and a significant financial help from Sergei Rachmaninov, the world's famous Russian composer who also immigrated to the United States for the same reason in 1918. Rachmaninoff was already known as a virtuoso pianist and a conductor. He was widely considered one of the world's finest pianists of his day, and as a composer, one of the last great representatives of Romanticism in Russian classical music. When he heard that Sikorsky was about to give up his aviation design career for good, he sent him a check for $5,000, which in our days would be over $80,000 in equivalent. And only due to this one single act of kindness and friendship between two Russians, today we see all of these amazing American aircraft. And yet, we never think of the genius who stands behind them and what kind of difficulties he went through to make them happen. S-43 Baby Clipper became only one of many dozen of the airplanes and helicopters that Igor Ivanovich Sikorsky designed and produced in 50 years of his career between 1908 and 1957. And finally, in conclusion, my personal favorite of all time, the world's fastest serially built turbojet ever, SR-71 Blackbird. It was introduced in January of 1966 and remains the fastest airplane in the world to this day, reaching speeds over 3 Mach. Yes, there are faster experimental ramjet aircraft in existence, but we are talking about serially produced turbojets specifically. A total of 32 aircraft were built. 12 were lost in accidents, none to enemy action, which is understandable because this is not a combat aircraft. SR-71 is pure reconnaissance aircraft that has no armament. It was designed with the smallest radar cross-section that Lockheed could achieve, an early attempt at stealth design. Flying at 80,000 feet meant that crews could not use standard masks, therefore protective pressurized suits were produced for the crew members. The cabin needed a heavy-duty cooling system, as cruising at Mach 3.2 would heat the aircraft's external surface well beyond 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Blackbird pilots were provided with food and drink for the long reconnaissance flights. Water bottles had long straws, which crew members guided into an opening in the helmet by looking in a mirror. Food was contained in sealed containers, similar to toothpaste tubes, which delivered food to the crew member's mouth through the helmet opening. This beautiful aircraft has special meaning to me. In late 80s, I was a student at Kharkov Aircraft Design University in Soviet Union and was assigned a task of designing high flight level supersonic strategic bomber as my graduation project. It was a study project, of course, but none of it was hypothetical. In order to graduate, you are required to design an aircraft that is near suitable for real-life production. I chose to base my design on SR-71 and XB-70 Valkyrie as a prototype. And yes, in 1980s, Soviet Union had sufficient technical design documentation for these aircraft to consider. My aircraft ended up being more akin to the Valkyrie, but I learned a lot from this beautiful black American beast about supersonic compression shock and other aspects of Mach 3 flight. On this note, let's conclude our overview of this impressive museum. I enjoyed my visit and I hope you did too. feel free to leave your comments and subscribe. And now, until the next time, good luck and stay tuned.